Thank you very much, and pleasure to be here today. So hopefully you can hear me clearly. I'm looking forward to obviously your questions at the end. And I do share the same heritage as Paul Janssen. I'm Dutch half, although I was born in Australia. So a quick introduction to myself. I've been based in Singapore since 2004, but been working across the Asia region for quite a long time prior to that, and obviously since then. My passion is around enabling both companies, clients, people, and society, particularly around data. So I'm very, very passionate around this topic of data trust. I'm going to go through a presentation today, so let me just present my screen. Just a little bit of patience there while I do that. So let me share my screen. I'll become a little bit smaller to you. So what I'm going to talk about is unlocking the value of data. And we go very much from a value-based equation. I think a lot of things that Paul said, I won't reiterate some of that, and apologies if I do duplicate, but I'll try not to. I just need to do one more minor thing. Okay, done. So in terms of conversation points today, covering off one, just to reiterate what the opportunity is, why data sharing, but importantly what we've just been going through is that trust is critical. And I really want to focus on that trust point. Then I'm going to drill down into some of the examples in Singapore where we've been working with the government and others and really looking at this equation. How do you build a framework for enabling this? And then share an example actually where across multiple companies, government, we've actually brought together 80 companies in a data sharing platform to really enable outcomes and return on investment, positive outcomes for both society but companies as a whole. So this is kind of where I'm going to go through. I'll go through a couple of key takeaways. So what's a data opportunity? I think most people here hopefully understand this. And I'm using a PwC statistic here. So the 15.17 trillion, there's McKinsey studies, there's lots of studies in terms of the objectives. Underpinning this, though, is also the investment in data privacy. Data privacy is critical. Data privacy, cyber breaches, mishandling, misuse of data often erodes data outcomes. So this is an important point, that both there's upside, but there's downside. What we find also is data-driven firms are more confident, more agile as it goes out of crisis. Being able to access information quicker, faster, and more information is better. But to do that, you need to be able to get the information, you need to be able to trust your data, and that also means trust data that you're being shared with as well. In Singapore, we have a big vision around growing Singapore as a smart artificial intelligence vision. It's really growing. There's a lot of investment. We are seeing this across the globe. A lot of countries are investing around this. And this is, I think, an important part also, building the foundation. This is not just about corporates, but it's about building the infrastructure, building the capability within the country level. Singapore, again, building data into the heart of digital government, so leading with government. We have digital data sharing through government-facilitated authentication, which we've just been talking about, through government, which really helps companies be more efficient, but also builds trust in the process. And ultimately, this comes down to spend. So Singapore is a small country, but we really are just we're a reasonable size here, but we're not very big. So this investment is quite large and quite critical to the future. So I'm just sharing Singapore examples here, but I'm quite proud of Singapore, but I'm also really great to see so many other countries stepping into this space. So is it really simple in terms of the equation? And I think this is an important equation to look at. When we talk about AR, we talk about data outcomes. It's the algorithms. We often focus on data science. We often focus on compute. But the underlying data is what gives the opportunity. You need volume of data, but you need quality data. If your data is poor quality, or you don't have access to data because it's in silos or other people haven't, this becomes a problem. And this 15.7 trillion outcome and the big impacts on GDPs around the world and the benefits, etc., are being held up by a data conundrum. So one of the things I'm just going to use this simple analogy to explain. I think it's important to look at this from a complete ecosystem perspective. So not just from an algorithm compute data, but look at this holistically. So one of the things we did was we've been thinking a lot about this, and particularly I challenged my team and myself on how can I explain this simply? Because many stakeholders perhaps not those in this room today or listening in, you understand what AI is, but I find more and more people don't know actually what AI is and how to enable it. I get people think AI is a magic wand. I think this data outcome is just going to happen. But really, it's a foundation of an ecosystem. So the analogy I have is a tree. The fruit on the tree is the data outcomes. That's the things we get when we go digital. We use AI or we just have better data intelligence. So this is really what we're trying to achieve. But to get a good tree, you need a whole heap of components to work together. Paul highlighted around architecture, making sure that the right data source, permissions, etc. So the base, we need the right data foundation. So a tree analogy needs soil and seeds. As we go up through that, to make a strong tree, a tree that gives us lots of fruit, we need strong trunk and roots. That's all about managing the data. And ultimately, we need outcomes. Now, we need to have a vision from top down because we need to know what outcomes we're driving, but we also need to know bottom up. What do we have in place, and then what structures do we need to put in place to manage this? So, a foundational standpoint, this includes privacy, cyber, understanding what existing data we have, what's data sources, data frameworks, and this includes actually government involvement here in building the environment, building the framework, looking at regulations that help protect, but also enable companies, individuals, etc. in this journey. The next layer is around how we manage data. So there's data management, data lakes, data virtualization, data meshes, data sharing really comes into this. This is really important. And I'll go into more detail later around metadata and the importance of this. And I think data management is probably the most under-delivered area and probably one of the bigger demand areas going forward because this is the key. And then ultimately, when we talk about business outcomes, we're looking at how do we increase revenue, how do we reduce costs, how do we manage risk, and we do that through analytics, automation, visualization, but we need this responsible AI, this ethical approach to things. We can't just go and do it. So this is important. So data sharing, I'm sure we've been through the definition, but just to reiterate, it's really around the transfer, granting of governed access to data between entities or individuals for the achievement of mutual benefits. It's purpose-driven, so it can drive tangible financial benefit, it can also drive social benefits, but keys around purpose, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But really this is important because one of the things here, when you share data, depending on how you share, so if you share actual personal data as an example, once you've shared, if you share at one time, unless you've got the ability to be very, very clear and know for certain that the data is being deleted or will never be used again, it's gone. So a lot of trepidancy around sharing is quite challenging. So there's a lot of risk when you share and a lot of reticence. People are very reluctant to share because of the concerns there. So why do data sharing? So a couple of points here. And the first one is around sort of inaccessibility of data. So World Economic Forum has a program called Data for Common Purpose Initiative, worth reading. So DCPI under World Economic Forum. So PwC will be helping drive some of this. The headline on this is there's 2.5 quintillion bytes of data created each day. I think we know that. But most of it's siloed. Most of it's trapped off, walled off in databases, inaccessible because of a variety of complexities cutting across policy, regulatory, commercial, technological, and actually the big one is perception of what the risk is and is not. When we talk about competitive advantage, 86% of executives, so I'm just going to reduce my volume a bit so that the interpreters can hear clearly. I'm just getting a message on the side. Thank you. So competitive advantage. 86% of executives say that their companies are in a race with competitors to extract value from data. To do that, you need to know what the data is. You need to be really focused around this. The other areas here, social benefits, overall data access sharing is estimated to drive massive gains. There's been some research through OECD, which totals around approximately 2%, I'll share the statistics later, impact on GDPs globally per annum. It's around 1 trillion per annum impact. So it kind of tallies with the 15.7. My math is a little bit bad, but that's kind of where it tallies. And ultimately, this is all, we see broader benefits, particularly around social outcomes, health, etc. The final point I'll say in terms of measurable economic benefit, Gartner did a recent report. They saw that data analytic leaders who share data generate 3 times more measurable economic benefit. So it's 3 times uplift in benefit to the organisation if they're able to share. And that's sharing not just externally, but that's even internally within the organisation. Because one of the challenges of sharing is not just do I share with a third party, but can I even share within my company? So why is trust critical in data sharing? Trust is critical because most consumers, whilst they're happy to share, they see it as a necessary evil. There's a lot of reluctance. When you look at senior executives, we talk about the war for talent, the ability to attract talent. 82% of senior executives said in a recent survey they would leave their current employer if they felt the approach to data was not ethical. This is really critical. So this is not just about getting consumers, it's also about retaining your people. Broader than this, we're talking about data security, privacy here. These are the killers of data sharing. So the honesty and transparency, critical to building trust. Moving to competitors, avoiding companies. These are critical things. You can read through here, but over and over, the research is showing that customers will switch off from companies where they don't trust them. This trust agenda is really important. So, bringing some of this to life in a Singapore context. These are some of the publications and frameworks we've been working with Singapore government to help develop. The Trust Data Sharing Framework and Data Evaluation Framework, these were created back in 2019. And this goes back even further through sort of 2017 when we started working around blockchain solutions for data sharing. What came through time and time again is actually this reticence around sharing. So the objective of the Singapore government was to build frameworks, to build data sharing agreements to help people understand, one, what is the value of data? Because if you can value data, then you start saying, okay, I can value data, I can understand the risk, the cost, and then I can drive sharing because I can see that I can make some money from here. The Trust Data Sharing Framework provides a framework of how you can share, the details of the key consideration points around risk, around what data you should or shouldn't share, what are the barriers and what are the challenges, etc. And more recently, which was published late last year, the Association of Banks in Singapore created a handbook for banks, but it's also for non-banks, focusing very much on around the journey, what's the process of data sharing, what are the key considerations, what are some of the steps you need to go through, and what does that actually look like, giving examples, etc. I'm actually going to walk through that in a little bit of detail. So the data sharing journey, this is a sort of step-by-step process. I'm about to show a slide which has a lot of detail, so I'm not going to go through all the detail in the next slide, but it's a step-by-step process. It is not necessarily meant to be sequential. It is shown as a sequential journey to make it easier to understand. The objective of this is to demystify and show companies, both banks and non-banks, key steps in the process. This report, this handbook, has a foreword by the Associated Banks. It was signed off by the Banking Association in Singapore and the member banks. It also has a foreword by the regulator. So this was done in conjunction with regulators to really promote and activate data sharing. In Singapore, the regulator is perhaps unusual. The regulator wears both a promotional hat and a regulatory hat. So what that means is responsible regulating, making sure I'm managing systemic risk to the community, to the environment, to the country, but at the same time promoting outcomes, and promoting innovation, promoting the use of data. So it's kind of a double balance there in terms of what's happening. So data sharing journey, as I said, a lot of detail here. This is in the handbook. I've referenced it so you can see. So by all means try read, but I'm going to go through each of these steps in a moment. Essentially, it follows 3 broad areas. 1, define opportunity and assess the feasibility. So is this actually a real opportunity or not? And is it possible? Second is build out the model. Contracting is really critical as well. I'll come back to contracting a little bit more in a moment. And then 3, how do you implement it? How do you make sure you're ready to go? How do you monitor and build for the future? Again, important steps. In doing this, the roles involved range quite broadly. This is not just the domain of data scientists. It's not just the domain of data management. This includes people from technology risk, cyber teams, legal, risk, compliance, the business, all these different people. So lots of different people need to be brought together around this discussion. It is a complex conversation, and it's not something just for the CDO. It's a full business. So if I look at the first part in terms of planning, the first step is establishing principles around a data sharing vision and journey. Now, what we came up with, and when I say we, the banks work through this, I help facilitate the process. So this is an industry-driven initiative, and I'm going to be very careful that I don't say PwC came up with this because that's not accurate. So first principle, data sharing needs to be purpose-driven. So it needs to be a clear purpose of the why. In a banking context, that may be related to your license. So are you licensed to do certain activities or not? But there needs to be a purpose. You can't just share for the sake of sharing. The second big thing here is protection of the data is aligned with the sensitivity of data. Not all data is equal. So, and that's quite important because as you get to what I'd call higher trust information, that requires more security, more protection. Lower trust is less so. Lower trust will be non-commercially sensitive. So information that you've hacked or abused may not impact anyone. That would be very low sensitive. So actually understanding that's very, very important. People doing the data sharing have to have the necessary skills to do this. This is not just the skills around privacy encryption technologies, but the ongoing management of data. Unfortunately, I've been involved in 2 large investigations over the last couple of decades where there's been breaches around people handling data, resulting in major outages or major customer loss of data. And a lot of the time this comes down to making sure not just we've got the right technology in place, but actually the skills. Having the right skills in place to manage and do the job of handling the data. Because sometimes we forget because we're often very technical around data as data scientists, data engineers, data architects, etc. But we forget some of the other basics. So this is important. The next one is around and I've talked about protection. Data is proportionate that is shared. You only share what you need to share, something Paul talked about. You don't share more than you need to, because the more you share, the higher the risk. So it needs to be proportionate. And finally, the sharing has a legal basis. So you understand the rights and obligations that attach to the data. You're sharing it within the legal basis of what's been given to you for in the first place. So that includes consent, but also includes, do you know who you're sharing it with? So some data you may not be allowed to share with third parties. So a lot of this stuff here, these principles are really, really important. So part of this first step also, obviously look at use case. That's quite important, and back to the purpose. Look at data sources and work through that. That's kind of the first step. As you start doing that, you quickly move on to understanding and categorize data types, domains. So then you start getting into, okay, I want to share information about, say, my customers, but what information do I want to share? Do I want to share broad demographics or specifics? So that starts to define where the regulations kick in or not, consent requirements, etc. And this is where it gets important to actually be very clear around metadata, the quality status up front. So when we're talking about sharing, what specific part of the data we're sharing, and are we clear around the quality? Because from a monetary model, if you're sharing data of poor quality, then it's a lower value. If you're sharing data that's got a time bound, so it's valuable for a period of time, and after which, as it ages, it becomes less valuable, again, very important. So metadata classification is an important part. And this more broadly is a very big part for all organizations, irrespective of your data sharing journey, Data monetization journey. You have an asset, which is your data. If you don't understand the data, you don't understand the quality of the data, it's very difficult to sell. You might be selling, underselling, overselling, or worst case, actually giving data away that you should never have given away. And once you've given it away, the ability to get it back is very complex. This is the big step in here. So again, we focus on this assess, determine sensitivity. Are there regulatory types of sensitivity? So in Singapore, from a banking context, data is considered high sensitivity if it can have a material impact on the institution or the individual customer, that is. Customer can be corporate, not just personal. So again, as you share, if you're sharing sensitive data, then the obligations start going up very high. You need to identify the explicit consent required. So more and more in this world around data use is really important. And we'll come to this later, but I'll just touch on it very briefly. If you are sharing data which has got specific use only, as you share it with a third party, you need to make sure, particularly if it's regulated heavily, that you know that third party only uses it for that purpose. And that's not so easy again. And that starts putting increased costs around data sharing. So you need to be very clear. I know they're only using it for this purpose. They're not reselling it onto someone else. They're not repurposing it. This is important. And then you need to work out whether you're going to desensitize information. Anonymization, encryption. Increasingly, we're seeing use of tokenization. So tokenizing and working out which bits of data do I want to tokenize, anonymize, encrypt, and what technologies do I need to use. Those technologies will vary based on the sensitivity. High sensitivity, you start going down towards more tokenization. So as we put this in place, we need to define a data sharing model. So are we going to sell this direct, so bilateral, company to company, company to individual, or are we sending one to many? So again, need to look at those models and how do we actually also monetize it? Is it valuable? So do we know the value as well? Do we want to create a virtual environment where we provide governed access for a period of time, which then allows us to create a virtual auction place to identify and determine the value of the data? And this is part of the different commercial models, which is quite complex. And often it's difficult to value data because what's value to you might be different to someone else. And that's where you sort of need the economic modelling around some of this, and you might even get into sort of marginal cost, marginal revenue type models. And this is a challenging area because often buyer versus seller is quite different in terms of their views on the actual value of data. And that links also to risk because you've got to value your data and the commercial model is going to be aligned to the risk. The higher the risk, potentially the higher the cost, or the higher the environment you need to have those controls. One of the things that Paul talked about is in terms of legal recourse. Legal recourse is good. It's important to have that in place. But the reputation damage from a breach or a leak can last much longer. So whilst you have legal recourse, that's assuming you're contracting with someone in your country. That's assuming you can get the person. You still have the impact. So one of the important things for all this process is not just relying on legal recourse, it's having controls in place that are commensurate with the risk. This enables things. Then look at data sharing methods. So are we going to do raw transfer, anonymization, federated learning? Am I going to provide governed access? Am I going to use APIs? So the question before around APIs, and we do see huge value in APIs in terms of providing data and speeding up processes. So many banks are using APIs now to provide direct bank statement access. So that means, and I work for an accounting firm, so this is a bit topical for us, but cash at bank is what you see on your screen in your company. You don't need to do reconciliation anymore. So these things start, that's an API, it's a data share. But it's a data share of their own data. So these are vast mechanisms and help manage the process through. Identify legal and regulatory. I've been talking about this over and over. Really, really important. When we look through regulations around data sharing, you've got to look across multiple different regulations. In Singapore, there's regulations around outsourcing. So how do you use third parties and what controls do you have around third-party risk management? This is one of the things to be looking at. Also around cyber security requirements is quite important. And there's a variety of other regulations which you need to start looking at. A lot is around actually the governance of the contract, the governance to make sure as you share, the third party that you're sharing with has the ability to execute against what you've contracted. I'll say again, the third party has to have the ability to execute. So if you're sharing sensitive information and you've contracted and the person says, yes, I can do this. But if you haven't actually checked, you might be end accountable. So the way the regulator looks at it in Singapore says, irrespective of who you share information with, irrespective of who does your processing, so you outsource payroll or you outsource your marketing, whatever you might use a third party for, bank, you are still accountable. If they have a problem, you're accountable. So back to, yes, you can have legal recourse, but from a regulatory standpoint, the data owner is accountable. So this is quite important. Establishing data sharing agreements, these are quite complex. In Singapore, we've actually built out a number of reference documents to provide sort of templates to make it easier because different legal teams have different views around this. You need to map this obviously with different stakeholders. As I mentioned, there's multiple different stakeholders across the organisation. We put in the data sharing principles of guide. These are key things to consider through there to make sure you tick these things off. And establishing data lifecycle management for onboarding, offboarding data. One of the things I find very difficult is the disposal requirements. So if you share information, what do you mean by disposal and destruction? What if someone's backed it up? Can you destroy in a backup? What's the requirements around that? So this is very careful. Disposal is often the bit that has a lot of challenges longer term. So these are quite important considerations. So in terms of putting it together, one, obviously you've got to assess the readiness to implement, plan, align, activities, roles, and responsibilities. This is 101. So we're racing, roles, responsibility, accountability, consult, inform, be very, very clear on the roles. Data governance, protection, security, quality protocols, frameworks, and controls. These are all important. These are things we've built out. Prepare, build, test environments, data algorithms. We've got to test. Again, all of this lines with sensitivity. The more sensitive, the more we have to do on this. The less we have to worry about it. And then you start moving to share and integrate data models. The next piece is monitor data sharing. Monitor risks, manage defects. So it's no good just checking in once a year that everything's working okay. If it's highly sensitive, you need process around this. Have breach management processes. You need to test these as well. In Singapore, there's regulatory expectations to report these things within 24 hours. So you need to know if there's a breach at the third party and report to the regulator within 24 hours. Not 24 hours of you finding out about it, but 24 hours of the event happening. So this is important. Rollback plans, etc. And then obviously monitor and manage consent where required. These are quite heavy lift activities here, but the prize is high. And then finally, it's building for the future. We want to make sure I look at how to way to improve the model, explore different opportunities. As you start building and start doing one-time data sharing, the opportunity to build is great because once you put the infrastructure in place, it becomes easier. There is an opportunity for third parties to come in and start managing this process and help broker these deals as well and build trust because this is the enabler. Key, at least from our perspective, is working with the regulators, industry bodies to increase the education, better understand the risks and what the real risks are or are not, and then help build an ecosystem which enables it. Everyone gains ultimately from this data sharing. And then finally is showcase success stories for new value creations. So I'm going to go now to a short case study to give you an example. And I'm probably going to finish a little bit earlier in time, so hopefully that's good for the organisers in terms of finishing a few minutes early to give you some extra time back, but also happy to answer quite a lot of questions as need be. So in Singapore, what was found is we now have a Singapore Trade Exchange. This is a digital infrastructure that facilitates trusted, secure sharing of data across the supply chain. Where this came from is a couple of things. So one, as a result of COVID and the disruptions, a lot of focus from a government level and industry of what could we do? How can we fix things? So the program brought together 80 plus participants, so both multinationals, large local companies, SMEs, startups, government agencies and banks, to try and come up with solutions and ideas of how can we make supply chain better. One of the backdrops to this also was an unfortunate incident in Singapore, where an oil trading company unfortunately was repackaging and doing multiple trade financing for one bill of lading. So in the oil industry, in Singapore, we have a lot of ships coming through, and they're fueled by bunker vessels. A bunker vessel holds a lot of fuel, so $20, $30, $40 million worth of fuel. Bunker companies are paid 60, 90 days with no credit, with no collateral. So they finance it. They use trade financing through the banks. What was happening was a trade financing company was selling off multiple bill of lading over and over. So effectively financing one ship 4 or 5 times. That, when we had the oil crash a couple of years back, caused a massive problem because they could no longer pay back the loans. And that was a massive impact on the economy and the industry. And that was because there was this inefficiency in the way that information was shared. So I'm going to go to the next slide. I'm going to do a short presentation. So I'm going to press play here to give an overview of what it is. Just bear with me.
Vast amounts of information flow through many people and companies every day to get goods moving. At present, shipments are checked repeatedly by different parties in a fragmented supply chain ecosystem. With rapid changes in technology and the global economy, the time for us to reimagine the future of supply chains is now. That's why we've created SG TradeX, a common data infrastructure to connect all parties in a data-driven and coordinated supply chain. SG TradeX lets everyone plug in securely to share trade-related data efficiently with supply chain partners. This allows you to better optimize your processes with your partners and within your own company. Expect more opportunities for collaboration to reduce costs and improve productivity on trade matters. Using SG TradeX, you can maximize the value of your business data while maintaining full control over the information you want to share. When different parties of the supply chain come together in a trusted data environment, we can innovate for the future. SG TradeX, your gateway to trading digitally. Join this movement to accelerate the digitalization of the global supply chain industry and be the change you want to see. Have an idea on how to transform your industry? Get in touch with us.
So that is an example of what that's kind of the short video on the SG TradeX. And I'm just going to go to my next slide and hopefully doesn't start the presentation again. Sorry.
Vast amounts of...
Okay, so who is involved? There's a lot of logos on this page in terms of different companies. So you can see the use cases. These were the first 3 use cases. Use case A is the one I'm focusing on. It's around trade, finance, fraud detection via physical to digital twinning. You can see this is led by the regulator, MAS. You've got Standard Chartered Bank, there's DBS, Mizuho, OCBC, UOB, SMBC, a variety of financial institutions in terms of the financing banks. You've got trading companies like Trafigura, Chevron, all very large names coming together. Across this, there's more than 50 plus companies who have agreed to do data sharing. In the instance of the one on the left, it's simply the bill of lading. This is a digitization, step 1. I'm sharing digital content for the first time. Lots of challenges around what happens if the data's wrong, who is owner, who's accountable, etc. So a lot of work through the data sharing frameworks was leveraged through this, but then what they did was create something very specific for Singapore Trade Exchange. At the end of the day, what this means now is a single platform which acts as a highway for data. It's permission-based, so people only share what they want to share, and they give permission for each company to then go and access this. The ROI on use case 1 is around about $200 million. Now, that's not necessarily massive, but this is big all the same, because this is one of the unique data sharing instances around the world at scale where we're seeing a monetization benefit. The ownership of this is owned combinations by a number of banks, the regulators, and others combined. So this is what you call a modern data cooperative. And the objective of a data cooperative, or any cooperative, is to create an environment for people to do something that benefits each individual, but then longer term, the cooperative self grows. And you can see there's multiple other use cases. Right now, there's more use cases coming through around green financing, as an example, and we go on beyond there. So SG TradeX, really the vision here is to connect the supply chain and global supply chains. At the moment, this is Singapore focused, but really to drive supply chain ecosystem to be more productive, create higher resilience, less shock through volatility, but ultimately build trust. This is not a complex solution from a technology architecture standpoint. This would cry out for things like blockchain, but part of the process of getting companies, CEOs on board is giving them solutions they can understand and can trust. It's step by step, building the trust, building the foundation. So the heart of this is around trust. Without trust, this would not happen. And that's where most of the work was spent, is building not just the use case, but the trust around the execution of this. A key cornerstone of this was the fact that regulators helped drive this, was the fact that the Ports Authority was heavily involved, was the fact also we had a catalyst event, both COVID, but also this shock around the fraud. So this is a real-life example. We're seeing others. I mentioned Data for Common Purpose Initiative from World Economic Forum around North Star projects. Interestingly, some of those are supply chain as well. And these are around projects that are trying to drive data sharing for common purpose, to really drive, and that common purpose is critical. As I went back to the principles, number one is purpose. And finding use cases which give multiple participants outcomes is really key. This one, the simplicity is just digitization of existing information that companies are sharing. And it's the efficiency that's the goal. This then leads to a longer term play around the ability to access more information securely with trust to then drive AI outcomes. That's not the objective of this program, but longer term it does lead to that. So this is why I think this is a very important one to understand. So this is my final slide. Now I'm definitely quite a few minutes early here, so I'm happy to answer a number of questions and go into detail. I'll give everyone a break. So when we look at data sharing, it can open doors to a myriad of economic and social opportunities. We have in this world today countries that are quite wealthy and have very good talent pools, but the impact of AI can often be felt most in those countries that don't have that. Yet our data is locked up more and more at a country-by-country level. Yet the reason for doing that is obviously partly because we want to protect our own industries, we want to grow our own talent pools, and we're concerned around cyber. But cyber is a global risk, it's not location risk. So we need to understand deeper why we're keeping data in different locations and understanding how we enable this. It's been one of the big battles around the health agenda. Being able to share information across countries around health is really critical to solving crises such as COVID. So how we do that's important. But again, do we need to share PII information? What information do we need to share? We need to get into that metadata. And fundamentally, when I look at the data tree, our issue right now is a lot of the soil, the seeds are mixed. It's not very clear. We've not defined exactly what nutrients we need to drive our models, which nutrients we need in our data sharing journey. So we need to be clear and crisp around that. We live in a world where customers, employees demand trust and transparency, how data is being shared. To do that, back to the metadata, back to the data sharing frameworks, back to the trust frameworks. These are all very important. Back also to government support around creating frameworks and making it easier for companies. In Singapore, IMDA, the Infocom Media Development Authority, has a data trust certification, which actually certifies companies are good at handling data. Again, increasing the trust, making it easier for companies to step into this space. So ultimately, for data sharing to fulfill its promise, and for AI to fulfill its promise, it needs to be done right. We need the trust frameworks, we need fit-for-purpose technology, we need companies to innovate and drive, but we need this broad ecosystem We need to focus on purpose, vision around the outcomes, and not getting caught up in perception, but dealing through the reality of what data enables outcomes and what are the methods I go and do this. I don't have to worry about all the risks. I can manage risk. An extreme example, and probably I'm not sure it's the best one to leave away, but in terms of risk, one of my clients has very highly sensitive data. It's a debt collecting company. So debt collectors know who owes people money. That's sensitive. It's embarrassing information, but it's also quite sensitive information. That's what they do. They operate offline. They have no connection to internet, so they've reduced the risk. So the cost of operation, the cost of the risk is more around physical security rather than virtual. So again, I challenge. When we want to share information, there's ways to share, there's ways to look at this, but we need to understand the risk. We also need to understand the reward. So that understanding the value of your data is also important, because then you drive around risk versus value. So that's all I had to share, and I apologise I'm a few minutes early here. So I'm happy to answer some questions in terms of that have been posed. But yeah, I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing your data trust services information. And now we are going to receive questions. Let me give you one of the questions that were registered. Data trust service is unfamiliar to us. What kind of benefits can this provide to normal people and normal companies? And what is your revenue model for Singapore PwC Data Trust?
A good question. So intrinsically, I think everyone understands that data has value. The problem is, do we trust our data? So our model is really two things. It's building trust in data. So understanding, if I use the analogy, I used the analogy of soil before, but if I have a piece of land, do I know the value of that land? To know the value of the land, I need to do a survey of the land. Do I know what's underneath the land? Do I know what usage rights? Can I use it to build something big or not? What's above it, what's around it, etc. So I need to understand that. So one of the things we do as a business is, and that's the metadata data management. We start looking at the soil, we look at the seeds and say, is this fertile or not fertile? Does this land have gold underneath it? Can I build a 50-story building on this? What is that? So look at the foundation first. So our model is really helping clients understand what they actually have and then put it in the context of use cases, but then drilling that back into value. For companies large and small, what that means is understanding your data assets, so cataloging. First, what do I actually have in terms of data? Two, understanding what quality it is. And do I want to enhance the quality or not? In turn, doing that, you also need to understand use cases. That's not always easy. Use cases can be as simple as digitization, so automation of a process, through to advanced analytics, data, AI to create outcomes I couldn't imagine before, multiple different use cases. But the first step is, what is my asset? The second step is then saying, okay, what are my use cases? So a lot of this, what we help our clients do is actually a value-based approach to how do I link data to value, not use case value in isolation. It's data to value. Use cases are obviously the driver, but value is a function of the revenue or cost reduction, less the effort it takes to get there. Effort equals time, equals money. It's those two parts of the equation. So we look at it very much from a economics model of how you determine what you have, what's the returns on that, what's the risks, therefore is it worth the effort at the end of the day. So it's very much a value-based approach. The second pillar, so one is trust in the data foundation. The second pillar is around how do I then use that data to build trust. So how do I actually drive my program to have long-term success in an organization or in the public domain? So what are the things I tackle first? Do I tackle the hard, complex thing first? Do I tackle the easy thing? Or do I tackle the thing that actually inspires the most? And it's about sequencing those things together. So hopefully I've answered the question.
Thank you very much. There were also questions posted on YouTube. Let me move on to the next question. My data services in Singapore. How far have you gone? Are the Singaporean people actively using my data services, and are the corporations interested in this?
So in Singapore, we have what's called SingPass, which has your personal information, which acts as an identifier to log on to many different websites, particularly around government websites, and that's heavily used as a primary source of login and authentication. We also have on our phones the same. Well, you can't really see there's my phone there. On our phones, we have our identity card, which again can be used. We have electronic identity cards, which are used for authentication. So more and more we're moving down this path. Alongside that, with the use of digital banking, this also keeps adoption up. People are getting more familiar with using digital devices and tools and technology to share information. Another key pillar is obviously regulating, making sure that there's clear penalties and people are aware of the penalties. The penalties are enforced if there are issues, so people feel comfortable that companies are doing the right thing. So in general, we're seeing a massive shift towards data sharing, data enablement in Singapore as a location.
네, 고맙습니다. And Mr. Jensen, I'm so sorry to ask you this, but for the next question, would you please decrease a little bit of your volume? Thank you. 네, 다음 질문 드리겠습니다. 역시 실시간으로 주신 질문입니다. 개인정보 사용 동의를
This is another real-time question. If the third party uses the information for individuals, how do you monitor and supervise that third-party company that manages personal data? Who's responsible for monitoring and supervising them?
It's a really good question, and this is a complex one. This is, I think, the hard part around data sharing or the use of any third-party organisation to help you in your business, but made more tricky through PII. So in Singapore, the regulator requires for banks that they are accountable. I said that before, but the question is how. So there is a couple of methods to do this. One is more often not companies perform an annual audit to make sure the third party is doing what they said they did. But that's only once a year. So how do you manage during the time up to that point? So what happens is generally you need to do first, one, due diligence. Am I comfortable that this company is of the right reputation? I know who they are. They're not a front. So not an organisation that I don't know, I don't trust. So I need to first do my due diligence. Are they someone I am comfortable sharing in the first place? I can have a contract, but actually I need to be comfortable that I'm okay to share. Because if you share with the wrong person, the first question is you should have known that you should not have shared with them. And obviously this is very important when there are bad actors in this world. Second is do due diligence on the company in terms of their processes. Are you comfortable they've got the right process in place? Just because they say they've got the right encryption doesn't work. Are you comfortable? And again, this depends on how sensitive. Highly sensitive, the more due diligence you have to do. Low sensitive, less. So you do due diligence on the process. Then you need active monitoring controls throughout the year to make sure they're doing what they're saying they're doing. That may be through monthly meetings where they present KPIs or results, but understanding not just the outcomes of what they're doing, but the controls around the process. An example, which is a real example with one of my clients a number of years ago. They outsourced, and this is not data sharing, but it's the same thing. They outsourced around processing of technology functions. They had very high turnover in the company. So it meant the team that was handling the data suddenly halved and they're working 100-hour weeks. So 100 hours per week, the team. When you work 100 hours per week, the risk of making a mistake goes up. So the risk of an operational event or causing damage or loss of data or integrity, it becomes higher. So when we talk about due diligence, I don't just mean around cybersecurity. I don't just mean around sort of the privacy encryption, but actually even down to how do they manage their team? Because if a company has high turnover, this can impact how they do the job they're meant to do. It may increase the risk. So we look at that. We look at employee screening. Do they screen the employees? One other problem, another client many years ago, was they did security awareness training only on employment. They didn't do regular awareness. So the team that was involved in the data breach got trained 20 years ago. They were not sufficiently trained to do their job in today's world. So these are some of the aspects. So to me, a lot of this is around due diligence. So am I comfortable day one? How am I comfortable on an ongoing basis? And then I'll add a third layer, which is a rigorous review on a, say, annual basis. That is a lot of cost. So it needs to be proportionate with the risk associated with the data. And that's where sort of this analysis around data sensitivity is really important to understand if I have a breach, what could happen? Yes, you have legal recourse often, but one of the issues we've seen also is when people engage legally, the regulator also said, you should have known that startup signed the contract because they were desperate for the contract. So startups want to sign a contract because they want the business. Doesn't mean they have the controls in place always. So these are really important considerations. So I realize I'm probably speaking too loud again. So apologies. That's my answer to the question.
네, 고맙습니다. 이어지는 질문입니다.
Another question. In your presentation, you talked about metadata. What do you mean by metadata? Does it mean the combination of financial data with non-financial data?
So metadata simply is data about data. So what that means is actually describing a data field. So if we think about a metadata around date of birth, it literally says that field is the day, that field is a month, that field is a year. Day is 2 digits, month is 2 digits, month goes up to number 12, days go up to 30, 31, 28, year goes 4 digits. So metadata is literally information that describes the data. By having that, that means as we start sharing, you are very, very clear. Because a customer, when you're sharing, you say, I will give you information on month of birth only, or maybe year of birth only. So for my metadata, I say I want metadata for year of birth only. If I have that defined in my data models, then it becomes easy to share. If my data is poor quality, so maybe I go year, month, day, or I go day, month, year, it's mixed, that becomes an issue as well. So these are important because when you share information, unless you understand your metadata, understand that it's consistently organized, you can share things, the wrong things, or you can share too much. So metadata is really, really important as a descriptor to describe what your data is, and therefore you can pinpoint exactly what I need to share for the outcome. Back to the point, only share what you need to share. And just because the other person says they want it, doesn't mean you give it either. You need to be clear you're okay with that as well. So hopefully that answers your question.
네, 고맙습니다. 아쉽지만 이제
Thank you very much. This would have to be the last question. And the last question is, in sharing data, the customers might feel high level of anxiety about because they don't trust. How do you overcome this lack of trust issues?
And trust, the customer trust is the same as company trust. So companies are very nervous around sharing this. This is why I think the SG TradeX is a good example. We form a cooperative. At the end of the day, that's information they're already sharing. What we've done there is created a platform to make it easier. So starting off with use cases where people are comfortable already is quite critical. Starting with use cases which are, say, health. So everyone is okay to share medical research around COVID because we all say this is a big issue and it's a global issue. So that becomes easier. So over time, we become more comfortable around this, and it gives the ability to demonstrate there are controls and mechanisms in place. So I think it's one, making sure we start simple, we start basic, we start on use cases that drive adoption and build trust. Two, these frameworks, these ways of doing data sharing are really critical. Government support, industry programs where help drive the ability of people to trust more. But the cyber agenda is most critical because a single breach or a single abuse can make everything go backwards very, very quickly. So care is required early to make sure you go through the data journey, as it were, that I painted before. The steps in there are really critical because ultimately trust is hard to get, but very easy to erode and destroy. Thank you.
네, 고맙습니다. 마크.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jensen, for your presentation and your answers. And I'm sure your insight has been very helpful to all the participants. Thank you.